The mechanic who found the medals said he almost threw them away. He'd been hired to clean out the garage on Fenwick Road after the county listed the property for back taxes, and he was 3 hours into the work, hauling out oil cans and old tyres and stacks of popular mechanics going back to 1971, when he found the shoebox on the shelf above the workbench. No label, duct taped shut. He cut it open with his box knife because he thought it might have cash inside, and instead he found 5 military decorations wrapped individually in cloth, each one nested in a small envelope, and inside each envelope a slip of paper with a date and nothing else. He called the county assessor's office. The county assessor's office called the VFW post on Birch Street. The VFW post on Birch Street knew exactly whose garage that had been. They'd been watching Clarence Otis Fenn park his '94 Silverado outside that post every Thursday for 11 years. Nobody at the post had ever asked Clarence Otis Fenn what his rank was. That wasn't entirely unusual. There were men who came in and talked freely about their service. What unit, what theatre, what year, and there were men who came in and ordered coffee and watched the game and went home. Fenn was the second kind. He sat at the end of the bar nearest the emergency exit, always the same stool, with his cap on the counter in front of him, and his hands folded around whatever he was drinking. He wasn't unfriendly. He laughed when something was funny, and he listened when someone talked to him, and if you asked him a direct question he answered it directly. But he never volunteered. He never started. He was 73 years old, or thereabouts. He walked with a slight drag in his left foot that got worse when the weather changed. He wore plain clothes, canvas pants, flannel shirts, work boots that had seen decades of use. The cap was the only thing that marked him. Army green, no insignia, worn pale at the bill. He kept it on the counter the same way other men kept their phones, like he needed it within reach. The post commander was a man named Harwick, Gene Harwick, who'd done 2 tours in Iraq and come back with a Purple Heart and a lot of opinions about everything. Harwick ran a tight post. He kept the bulletin board current and organised the Memorial Day parade. And once a month he hosted a game night that nobody came to, but that he kept hosting anyway out of what he called institutional stubbornness. He was the one who got the call from the county assessor's office about the shoebox. He drove out to the property on Fenwick Road himself. The mechanic had set the shoebox on the hood of his truck. Harwick stood there in the weak November light and opened it and looked at each decoration in turn, each folded cloth, each small envelope with its date. He recognized 3 of the decorations immediately. The 4th took him a moment. The 5th he'd never seen in person before, only in photographs, only in history books. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. The mechanic waited. He was a young man, and he could tell something significant was happening, but he didn't know what it was. "This man lives on Fenwick Road?" Harwick finally said. "Lived," the mechanic said. "He's at the VA facility over in Crestwood. Been there since August." Clarence Otis Fenn had grown up in the mill towns of western Pennsylvania, the 3rd son of a man who worked the blast furnace at the Allegheny steel plant for 31 years, and came home every evening with burns on his forearms and the particular silence of men who spend their days in proximity to dangerous heat. His mother had kept a kitchen garden and made pierogies at Christmas and sung in the choir at St. Casimir's every Sunday, and she had 3 boys, and she outlived 2 of them, which was not the way things were supposed to go, but often was. Clarence enlisted in 1969, which he said later was not an act of patriotism exactly, but an act of arithmetic. The draft was coming, and he preferred to have some choice in the matter. He was assigned to the 75th Infantry, and then to something he spent the next 50 years not discussing, and he went overseas in the spring of 1970 and came back in 1973, and did not discuss that either. What the people at the VFW post on Birch Street knew about Clarence Otis Fenn. He took his coffee black, he preferred the Steelers, but would watch any football. He had a daughter somewhere in Oregon who called him on his birthday and at Christmas, and he had a habit of arriving precisely at 7 in the evening and leaving precisely at 9. What they did not know anything else. The Saturday after Harwick found the shoebox, a man named Preston Wolfe came into the post. Preston Wolfe was 29 years old, and he worked in sales, and he had served 8 months in the Army Reserve before a medical separation that he had strong feelings about. Specifically, feelings that it hadn't been his fault, that the doctors had been wrong, and that he had been prepared to serve and would have served with distinction if given the opportunity. He came to the VFW post because his girlfriend's father was a member and had suggested it might be a good place to meet people. He had never been there before. He was not what you would call a quiet man. Within 40 minutes of arriving, Preston Wolf had explained to 3 separate people at the bar that he was in excellent physical shape, better, probably, than most of the men in the room, no offence intended, and that the reserve training he'd completed had given him a pretty solid foundation, and that frankly a lot of guys who'd actually deployed probably didn't have the technical background that he had, because the technical side of modern warfare was where it was really at. He said this last part to a man named Brubaker, who had 3 combat deployments and a Ranger tab and was holding a beer very carefully. Brubaker didn't respond. He had learned over the years that not responding was usually the right choice. Preston Wolf took the non-response as an invitation to continue. The mental toughness side of it, he said, that's really what separates people. And I've got that. I've tested myself in a lot of different ways. I ran a Spartan race last spring, I've done the cold water protocols, I read a lot of the SEAL stuff, the Jocko stuff, the David Goggins stuff. I understand the warrior mindset at a pretty deep level. Brubaker drank his beer. The bartender, a woman named Mac, who had worked the post for 14 years and had heard variations of this conversation more times than she could count, found something to do at the other end of the bar. What happened next was not remarkable, except that it was because of what came before it and what came after. The door opened. Gene Harwick had called ahead. He'd called Clarence Otis Fenn's daughter in Oregon and had a long conversation that left him sitting in his truck for 20 minutes afterward, not starting the engine. Then he'd driven out to the VA facility in Crestwood and sat with Fenn for an afternoon. And he had asked questions that he had not known to ask for 11 years, and Fenn had answered them with the same directness he brought to everything else. No drama, no self-pity, the way a man describes the weather in a place he's already left. And then Harwick had driven home and he had not slept well. Fenn walked in at 7 o'clock the way he always did, same canvas pants, same flannel shirt, cap in hand. He moved a little slower than usual, the cold probably, or the walk from the parking lot. He took his stool at the far end of the bar, nearest the emergency exit, and he set his cap on the counter, and he folded his hands, and he waited for Mac to bring him his coffee. He was aware of Preston Wolf, the way old men in bars are often aware of loud young men. Peripherally, without particular interest. The way you're aware of a television that's been left on in another room. He did not look at him directly. He looked at the cup Mac set in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it. Preston Wolf had moved down the bar by this point, drawn by some instinct toward new territory. He looked at the old man with the plain cap and the work boots, and he made a series of rapid calculations of the kind that young men in sales make constantly, assessing and categorizing, and what he saw was an old man who appeared to be alone and not particularly engaged in anything. "Hey there," Preston Wolf said. Fenn looked up. "You come here a lot?" "Thursdays," Fenn said. "And Saturdays when I can, you a veteran?" Fenn considered the question. "Yes," he said. "Yeah?" Wolf leaned on the bar with the comfortable authority of a man who believes a conversation has just become about him. "What branch? Army? No kidding, I was Army too. Reserve, but still, 8 months of training. It's no joke. That training, people don't appreciate how rigorous it is." Fenn looked at him for a moment with eyes that were neither unkind nor particularly warm. "No," he agreed. "They don't. What era were you?" "Vietnam," Fenn said. "Man." Wolf shook his head with the expression of someone performing respectfulness. "That must have been something. Tough situation over there. Politically, I mean. You guys didn't get the welcome home you deserved. I've read a lot about it. The whole thing was mismanaged from the top." Fenn nodded very slightly. "What did you do over there?" Wolf asked. "Were you infantry or—" "I did a few different things," Fenn said. "Yeah?" Wolf waited, and when nothing more came. "Like what?" There was a pause. The kind of pause that some people in the room noticed and others didn't. "I moved around," Fenn said. Wolf laughed. "Come on, man. No classified stuff anymore, right?" "That was 50 years ago." Fenn looked at his coffee. "Some of it still is," he said mildly. This was, in Wolf's assessment, the kind of thing a man said when he didn't want to admit he hadn't done anything especially interesting. He had seen this before. Older guys kind of build it up, let the mystery do the work. He didn't hold it against them. It was a generational thing. "Well," Wolf said, "I'll tell you, I have a ton of respect for the guys who served. A ton. I would have gone the distance myself if they'd let me. The medical thing was bull. He paused, recalibrating for the room. It was a bad call. I had the fitness. I had the mindset. I tested through the roof on everything psychological. They just had a quota situation and I got caught in the middle of it. Fenn said nothing. I mean, no offense to the guys who got through, Wolf continued, but I genuinely believe I would have been exceptional in the field. Not everybody has that. You know what I mean? Fenn looked at him. Then he looked away. Some guys do, he said quietly. And some guys find out. It was the most he had said, and the way he said it, not aggressive, not pointed, just certain. The way a man is certain about things he learned at a cost too high to argue about, made Preston Wolf's laugh come out a little uncertain at the edges. Fair enough, Wolf said. He reached for his drink. From down the bar without looking up, Brubaker said, Wolf, you should probably stop talking. Wolf turned. What? Brubaker set down his beer. He was looking at the old man at the end of the bar. Do you know who that is? A beat. Should I? What Gene Harwick had learned in his afternoon at the VA facility in Crestwood was the following. Clarence Otis Fenn had served as a Special Forces operator with the 5th Special Forces Group, Vietnam, and then with a unit whose designation Fenn provided without elaboration and which Harwick subsequently looked up and found references to in 3 declassified documents and nowhere else. He had completed 4 tours. He had been wounded twice, the left foot in 1971, something else in 1972 that he didn't specify and that Harwick didn't push. He had been decorated 5 times, the last of which was the decoration that Harwick had only ever seen in photographs, and he had received none of these decorations at a public ceremony because the nature of his work did not permit public ceremonies. He had come home in 1973, and he had worked as a machinist and then as a foreman at a machine shop in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, and he had been married for 22 years to a woman named Ruth Ann who had died of ovarian cancer in 2001, and he had 1 daughter, and he had never told Ruth Ann the full extent of what he had done or what he had been awarded, because it had seemed to him. And here was the part that had kept Harwick sitting in his truck for 20 minutes. It had seemed to him that telling her would have been a way of making himself important, and he had not wanted to be important. He had wanted to be her husband. He had wanted to be a father. He had wanted to come home. Did it feel like enough? Harwick had asked. Fenn had thought about it. Most days, he said. Harwick was sitting at the bar that Saturday, 3 stools from the end, when Preston Wolf asked his question. He let Brubaker speak first. Then he watched Brubaker had stood up from his stool. He wasn't a large man, but he stood like a man who has been required on multiple occasions to be the largest man in a room regardless of his physical size. He walked to the end of the bar, stood next to Fenn, not behind him, not looming, just next to him, and he looked at Wolf. Clarence Fenn, Brubaker said. 5th Group, Vietnam. 4 tours. Wolf glanced at Fenn. Fenn was looking at his coffee. He's got the Silver Star, Brubaker continued. He's got the Bronze Star with Valor. He's got 2 Purple Hearts. He paused. And he's got something else that I'm told almost nobody in this room has ever seen in person. So. Wolf said nothing. The Distinguished Service Cross, Harwick said quietly, from 3 stools down. The bar had gone progressively quieter in the way that bars do when the energy changes. Not all at once, but table by table, voice by voice, until the loudest thing in the room was the low sound of a game on the television in the corner that nobody was watching. Fenn still hadn't looked up. I don't talk about it, he said, to no one in particular, because there's nothing to say. We did what needed doing. Most of the men I served with deserved more recognition than I ever got. I just happened to survive long enough to collect some hardware. He picked up his coffee. The hardware doesn't tell you anything about a man's heart, he said. It tells you what he was near when the thing happened. That's all. He drank. From across the bar, a man named Kessler, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and never talked about them either, stood up from his table. He stood quietly, not making a production of it, the way a man stands when a flag goes by, not because someone told him to, but because something in him requires it. Then the man next to Kessler stood up. Then the woman in the corner, retired army nurse, 20 years, 3 deployments, who had come in for a quiet drink and had not expected her evening to go this way, stood up. Then Brubaker, already standing, straightened. Then Harwick. Then 2 others at the bar, whose names Wolf did not know and would not learn that night, because the night for him had stopped being about names. There were 6 of them, standing in a bar on a Saturday in November, not saluting. These were not saluting people, not in this context, just standing. The way people stand for things they can't put into words, the way the body knows what the voice can't manage. Fenn looked up. He looked at each of them in turn. His face didn't change dramatically. He wasn't a man whose face changed dramatically. But something around his eyes, something in the particular stillness of a man who has spent a lifetime not being seen and has just unexpectedly been seen, shifted, just slightly. He nodded once. "All right," he said very quietly. "All right," and he went back to his coffee. Preston Wolfe did not say anything for a long time. He sat on his stool and he looked at the old man at the end of the bar, and the old man did not look back at him, and eventually Wolfe set down his drink and he got his coat and he left. Nobody watched him go. Later that night, in his car in the parking lot, he would sit for a while with his hands on the wheel. He would think about the things he had said. He would think about the word exceptional and the confidence with which he had used it, and he would think about what that word meant in the presence of a man who had actually been required to find out whether it was true, who had found out in a place and in ways that no cold water protocol and no obstacle course and no book would ever simulate, and who had come home and put the evidence in a shoebox in a garage and taped it shut and gone to work as a machinist for 25 years and never once mentioned it. He would think about the word exceptional for a long time. Clarence Otis Fenn stayed until 9 o'clock the way he always did. He left $2 on the bar for Mac the way he always did. He picked up his cap. He stood and steadied himself, the left foot accommodating the first few steps the way it always needed to, and he walked through the bar the way he came in, without hurry, without ceremony. At the door he stopped. He turned slightly, not quite back toward the room. He put the cap on his head. "See you Thursday," he said. Then he walked out into the November dark and the door swung shut behind him and the bar slowly, gradually found its way back to its own volume. But not all the way. Not quite. If you were there that night, and a few people who were there have said as much, in the way people say things they don't quite have the vocabulary for, you would say that the bar felt different after Clarence Otis Fenn left. Not quieter exactly. More careful maybe. Like everyone in the room had been reminded of something they'd known once and let themselves forget. There is a particular kind of service that leaves no record because it was never supposed to. The men and women who did that work came home, and they got jobs, and they raised children, and they mowed their lawns, and they didn't explain. And most of the time their neighbours and their colleagues, and sometimes even their families, never knew what they had carried home with them. Not because they were hiding, because it wasn't a story. It was just a thing they had done, in a time that required it, for reasons that seemed obvious enough that they never felt the need to explain. Clarence Otis Fenn had put his medals in a shoebox, not because he was ashamed, not because he was broken, because he had come home, because he had a wife who needed him, and a daughter who was learning to walk, and a job that started at 6 in the morning, and none of those things cared about what he'd done in the dark, in Southeast Asia. And he had been fine with that. He had been more than fine with that. The shoebox was found because a county tax bill went unpaid, and the tax bill went unpaid because Clarence Otis Fenn had moved into the VA facility in Crestwood in August, and the VA facility cost more than his savings had anticipated. His daughter in Oregon was working on it. They were working on it together. Gene Harwick made some calls after his visit to Crestwood. The kind of calls a post commander makes when he decides something needs to happen. He was not a man who made noise about making calls. He just made them. Some things, he believed, were long overdue. The mechanic who found the shoebox asked Harwick later what the 5th medal was. "Distinguished Service Cross," Harwick said. The mechanic nodded when they're given an answer they don't have context for. "Is that? It's the 2nd highest combat decoration the Army gives," Harwick said. "Awarded for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy, so it's a big deal." Harwick looked at him for a moment. "You know what he told me when I asked him why he never told anyone?" he said. "He said, I knew what I did. The men I did it with knew. That always seemed like enough people." The mechanic was quiet. "He wasn't being humble," Harwick said. "He was just being honest. That's—" He stopped. Started again. He didn't put those medals in a shoebox because he didn't value them. He put them in a shoebox because he had better things to value. Clarence Otis Fenn still goes to the VFW post on Birch Street. Thursdays mostly. Saturdays when someone gives him a ride, he sits at the same stool, same cap on the counter, same hands folded around his coffee. He doesn't talk much more than he used to. He still doesn't volunteer, still doesn't start. But sometimes, on the slow evenings when the post is quiet and the game isn't on, and there's nothing particular to do, the younger members, the ones who served in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in places that don't have official names, will find themselves sitting a little closer to the end of the bar than they used to, not crowding him, not asking for anything, just near, and Fenn lets them be near, because he knows what they're carrying and they know he knows, and nothing else needs to be said. That's the thing about certain bars, certain rooms, certain silences. They hold the weight of things that can't be written down or framed or put on a shelf. They hold the weight of people who showed up when it mattered most and never asked for anyone to notice. And somehow, in the end, that weight is the only thing in the room that doesn't feel heavy. It feels like the ground, solid and permanent, and there whether you look at it or not.